about a year and a half. Everything in COVID is all fuzzy in my brain, but I think it was like last September or something like that. I guess a little. Anyway, he was that. Is that right? Wasn't it something like that? Anyway, he was
It was sometime in the fall.
It was
Yeah.
so
he
long ago.
was a speaker at this cool MK Summit thing I went to, and I loved his session so much. I got to have dinner with him and talk with him a little bit after that, and then I had this great idea that if this guy, this famous author and speaker, was going to come and speak at our little youth group, and he was like, "I'm down." So I'm very excited to have him with us tonight. I think this is a big honor for us, and I'm looking forward to hearing his awesome perspective on the issue that we're talking about this week, LGBTQ+. So let's give Greg a warm welcome and thank him for being here. Woo!
Thanks for that. Thanks for that kind introduction. Okay, so if your expectations are like up here, I need you to do me a favor and just like bring them down, because then like if your expectations are low and then you're like, oh, he actually wasn't that bad, then you're like pleasantly surprised and you're like, it was a well-spent evening. But if your expectations are up here and then it's disappointing, so bring them down, and then we'll see where we go from there. But I'm excited to get to talk to you guys. I'm excited that COVID makes it possible for me to be in all kinds of places tonight. My roommate, I was like, I've got to finish dinner so I can go and talk. And he was like, where at? And I was like, in Texas. I'm in Pennsylvania at the moment, which I hit a big landmark this year. I've now lived in Pennsylvania longer than I've lived anywhere else in America. But as you know, since my parents are pineapples, the longest place that I've lived anywhere in the world is not in America. It's in Indonesia. I lived on the island of Java in Bandung for 15 years. We moved there when I was 3, and then I came back for college. So this evening, my plan is I'll talk some about my own story, and I'll make some gestures more broadly toward other things that I hope will be helpful and productive to us. I know you guys had another Greg talking last week, so it's like a battle of the Gregs. No, I think you'll find that the other Greg and I eavesdropped on like bits of what Greg had to say last week. I think you'll find we have some points of resonance. You'll probably also find some ways in which I would either frame things differently or perhaps even disagree with what other Greg has said. But the important thing is that we think well about what it looks like for all of us to follow Jesus. So toward that end, I'll present you, the story that I've got, and then we can talk about it. So by all means, bring on the questions as we go. Let's have a good conversation here at the end. But in talking about my own story, I just want to be really clear in prefacing it to say that this is my story. So I don't want you to hear me saying this and be like, yes, like this story can be tidily mapped onto the life of every other person who experiences attraction to the same sex and then tries to figure out what it looks like for them to follow Jesus. There's a lot of stories, and I can't just be made into a carbon copy. One of my favorite novelists is the Nigerian novelist. Her name is Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. And which, if you haven't read any Adichie, I don't know if you're into like wonderful Nigerian fiction. It's so good. Do yourself and humanity a favor and read a little bit of Adichie, because she's just terrific. But she has this to say about the single story. She says, the single story creates stereotypes. And the trouble with stereotypes is not that they're untrue, but that they're incomplete, because they make one story and stretch it out to become the only story. So my hope is not that this would be the only story you hear, but that it would give us a place to begin, that it would perhaps spark some ideas in all of our minds about what it might look like for us to follow Jesus better. My story, I want to start for you this evening in middle school, which is, I think, for many of us, a traumatic time to begin a story. At least it was a traumatic time for me. But here's what happened to me in middle school. Because I grew up in Christian spaces, because as we've established, my parents were pineapples. Because I grew up in Christian spaces, I grew up attending a youth group. And there would be these moments during youth group when they would split us up into the boys and the girls, and this invariably meant that we were going to talk about sex. And I remember at this stage of my life, all the girls were like freakishly tall and wore a lot of eyeshadow. So they'd take all the tall eyeshadow wearing girls, they'd go off to one portion of the room, they'd get the guys together, and they'd be like, look, boys, we know what you're all going through. You want to look at pictures of naked women, but don't do it. And I was like, okay, no looking at pictures of naked women. And I discovered that I was remarkably good at not looking at pictures of naked women. I was like so good at it that I started to feel like I was like the holiest 12-year-old in the world. Because they kept saying like, here's the thing here's what happens to everybody. And I was like, I don't think it's happening to me. I think Jesus has spared me the experience of having a sexuality of any kind. And I was feeling really good. I'm like throwing out my elbow, patting myself on the back. But it took me a little while, maybe just because I'm slow about these things, it took me a little while to realize that I did actually have an experience of sexuality. It just wasn't the one that I had been trained and braced to expect. And so suddenly I went from feeling like the holiest 12-year-old in the world to feeling like the worst possible 12-year-old in the world, like the one who was so awful that nobody had even bothered to warn me that I might exist. So I began to wrestle with the question of what do I do if my attraction is only and exclusively toward people of the same sex instead of toward people of the opposite sex. There were sort of two prominent narratives that I knew of at the time in the world around me for how somebody who was gay, that was the word in the parlance at the time, how somebody who was gay or attracted to the same sex and wanted to follow Jesus. I knew of two things that you could do. One of those narratives was the ex-gay narrative. And this was the story that said, you need to figure out what has gone wrong in your upbringing. You know, you probably had bad parents. Maybe you had a distant father, an overbearing mother. Maybe you were abused as a child. You figure out what's gone wrong. And then you pray. And if you are obedient and follow Jesus, then Jesus wants to make you straight. That is the ultimate goal, is that you will develop a sort of experience of sexuality that's like the experience of the other people that you're hearing about. And so that was the narrative that I tried for most of my growing up years to sort of fit myself into. I looked at my parents and I was like, my parents are super cool. These pineapple parents of mine. I was like, my parents are super cool. So I don't think the issue was with my parents. I was like, I wasn't abused. I don't know if I can find the cause. But I was like, praying I can do. I love me some praying. So I prayed and I tried and hoped to be straight, to be the thing that I thought I needed to be in order to follow Jesus. And I attempted dating at one point, and I sort of measured the state of my spiritual life on the basis of how straight I felt at any given time, which led me to do some really silly things. So this is not a recommendation. This is not like a how-to, but also cut me a break, because I think I was like 13 at the time. There was this time that I remember seeing a picture of a scantily clad woman and thinking to myself, I've heard that if I love Jesus better, I would be straight. And if I were straight, I would see this picture and I would like feel something about it. Like I would want to lust after this picture. And so I was like, I'm going for it. So I took the picture and I was like staring at the picture, just trying to conjure up a sense of lust for this picture. Which in retrospect seems strange and remarkable to me. But at the time, that was the logic that was in my brain. This is what you have to do in order to follow Jesus. You have to become straight. Eventually, I reached a point where I began to realize, I don't know that this experience of sexuality is changing. And yet I see myself falling more in love with Jesus. I am growing in my faith. But it doesn't seem to be causing me to be more attracted to women. I'm still wrestling with attraction to men. And so I started to wonder, is the story that I've heard about how I'm supposed to become ex-gay, how Jesus wants to make me straight, is that story really true? So I started to look at the other story that I was familiar with, and this was the gay affirming narrative, the narrative that said, what you need to do is just revisit what the Bible has to say about same-sex sexuality, and actually you'll conclude that the Bible does not condemn loving monogamous same-sex relationship, and you can just enter into a marriage with somebody of the same sex. And I gave that narrative a very close look. It was really important because up until that point, I had just sort of dismissed it out of hand and said like, oh yeah, I hear it's wrong. And it was easy at first for me to say, obviously that's wrong. But I reached this crisis point where I realized I can't just keep ignoring this narrative any longer. I really have to come face to face with it. And when I did that, coming to face, I won't go into great depth about what I discovered, though we can certainly talk about it more when we get to Q&A if you want. But here were 3 things I discovered as I was doing that investigation. Which, by the way, let me just say in general, it is a really good and noble thing when we reach a crisis point in our lives and we're like, I don't know what to do about this. I'm beginning to wonder if what I've been told the Bible says is what it actually says. It's a really good and noble thing for us to actually go back to the Bible and to say again, like, I need to know what's in here. I need to see it for myself. I can't just take somebody else's word for it. You know, no matter how much I trust Caleb, no matter how much I trust Nadia, I can't just sort of smile and nod at them and be like, oh, sure, I'm sure you're right for the rest of my life. Like, I need to see it for myself. So when I went to the Bible, 3 things I discovered. Number 1, I discovered to my surprise that there was no biblical promise that I would be straight. Like, I was so ready for it to be in there somewhere, like right in the book of like Second Hesitations or something, right? Like, then shalt thou experience only the sexual desire for the opposite sex and never for the same sex, you know, thus saith the Lord. I was so ready for it to be in there, and it just wasn't. There was no biblical promise that I would be straight. There was no biblical promise that I would ever get married. There was no biblical promise that I would ever have sex. So that was the first thing that I discovered. The second thing that I discovered was that when it came to this question of what the Bible had to say about sexual ethics, about what somebody in my position was called to, if I experience, hey, I'm not attracted to a woman, I'm not really interested in marrying a woman, I'm only attracted to the same sex, what does that mean I'm supposed to do with my sexuality? When it came to the question of sexual ethics, I found that what the Bible had to say was actually a bit complicated, that it was a little more complicated than a lot of the well-meaning people in my life had made it seem when they said, you know, just flip open your Bible in the English translation, find the word homosexuality in there somewhere, it's bad, case closed, moving on to something more pressing like the Calvinist-Arminian debate. I found that the Bible was... what the Bible had to say was a bit complicated. And let me give you an example of what I mean by this complexity. And I know this is a thing that other Greg, what is other Greg's last name? I scribbled it somewhere. Greg Pruitt. I know Greg Pruitt made reference to this briefly last week. And with respect, I'm going to disagree with him. So, but you can make up your mind. Maybe you'll agree with Greg Pruitt, disagree with me. That's fine. We can carry on loving Jesus. But one of the things that Greg Pruitt mentioned to you last week was this Greek word arsenokoitai, or arsenokoites in the singular, which is the word that shows up in 1 Corinthians 6 and 1 Timothy 1, and is often translated homosexuals are men who have sex with men. And Greg Pruitt pointed out that this is a compound word. It's formed from the words arsene, meaning male, and koiti, meaning bed. You put them together, man, bed, man, better. Sure, yeah, somebody who's gay. And Greg last week made the suggestion that that you can just sort of take that word at face value and it's very, very obvious what it means, and that there's no significant question about that word, what that word means. Now here's the deal. When it comes to compound words, we can't necessarily just break apart the parts of a compound word and assume that each piece put together necessarily makes the whole word. Let me give you an example. The English word butterfly. You can't just be like, butterfly. It's like a winged dairy product, you know? Because language is actually a bit more complicated than that. So in the case of the word arsenokoitai, what we normally do when we're reading New Testament Greek, when we're reading Koine Greek to know what a word means, is we look at previous uses of that word outside of the New Testament, what are called extra-biblical uses of a term. Now, the fascinating thing about the word arsenokoitai is that it isn't used anywhere prior to when the Apostle Paul uses it. And the only uses after the Apostle Paul that we have record of are people referring back to Paul. So for all intents and purposes, it seems like Paul is making up a new compound word, and we're sort of guessing at what he means by it. Now, that doesn't mean we don't know what it means, because, in fact, these parts of this word, arsene and koiti, are the same Greek words that are used in the Septuagint translation, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament being used in Jesus' day. The Septuagint translation of Leviticus 18, which has another clearer prohibition of same-sex sexual activity. So if we have to take a guess what the word arsenokoitai means, it's a decent guess that it does in fact refer to men who have sex with men. So that's a very long and roundabout way of saying, when it comes to the final conclusion, I think Greg Pruitt and I would agree, like, yeah, we get to the same place in the end. We actually think that passage is trying to say the same thing. But I would want to acknowledge that there's some complexity along the way there. Because for me, when people didn't admit to me that there was any complexity, and then I actually looked into it and discovered the complexity for myself, I started to wonder what they had been trying to hide from me. I started to feel like maybe if they hadn't really been willing to acknowledge the complexity of the conversation, maybe they were just trying to hide from me the fact that their argument was weak and problematic all along. So I discovered that this conversation was complicated, that it was more complicated than I had expected. But I also discovered that there was still, as far as I could discern, a best answer to the question of sexual ethics, that even though it was complicated, that didn't mean that every answer was equally right, that there in fact was a truth in the Bible that deserved to be pursued, that I was called to pursue diligently. And when I pursued it, I landed in the answer that I feared instead of the answer that I wanted. And that was the answer that said that somebody like me who didn't feel called to and didn't really have any interest in entering into an opposite-sex marriage, that my only other biblical choice as a follower of Jesus was to be celibate, to be sort of permanently single. And at the time that I reached that conclusion, it seemed remarkably unfair to me. Because I was like, how come the straight people, they get to do whatever they want. They get to have the kind of sex they want, and why don't I? And so I want to read to you just briefly a passage from my book. So I have a book that came out in 2017 where I discuss this question, the question of unfairness. I want to read that passage for you. It says this: obedience was supposed to be costly. When Jesus told his followers to take up their crosses and follow him, he wasn't just calling them to place heftier checks in the offering plate or to put up with the occasional irritation at work. He was calling them to blood and sorrow and unspeakable agony. He was calling them to death. In many parts of the world, this calling to death is still very much a literal one for those who declare their allegiance to Christ. And if not death, perhaps the risk of beatings, of deprivation, of complete ostracization from family and community. But in the Western world, lulled by freedom of religion and unprecedented wealth, it's easy to lose sight of what words like suffering really mean. We begin to believe that ease and safety are the baseline experiences of humanity, the natural states of being from which any other state diverges. And suffering, when it comes, feels like a violation. Suffering shocks us. I'll follow you, we say to Christ so readily, watching the thorns dig into his forehead. And then, moments later, we cry foul when we discover thorns of our own. Maybe the problem isn't that Christians like me have received an impossible task in celibacy. Maybe the problem is that so many straight Christians have given themselves a task that is too easy, a cross too bearable. While gay or same-sex attracted Christians like me are expected to deny themselves in their desires for sex and family and intimacy, desires that feel so intrinsically part of their being, most straight Christians can simply channel those desires toward a single man or woman, get married, have kids, join a country club, attend a welcoming church where everything has been designed with people like them in mind, and chase the Jesus-festooned brand of the American dream. I don't mean to belittle the self-denial necessary to a God-honoring monogamous heterosexual marriage. Remaining faithful to a single partner is no small feat, or so I'm told. And certainly, some straight Christians who desire marriage may yet find themselves called to celibacy. Regardless of orientation, regardless of marital status, Christ's invitation to the cross remains no less true and no less necessary. But the road of celibacy for a Christian like me remains a distinctly complex calling. To not only resist sexual urges, but to try to banish the thought of ever fulfilling them. To have no daydreams of a future romance, no wistful marriage plans. To feel like the very core of your sexual desire and the faith you hold most dear are at odds with each other. There are sufferings far worse than this, but there is none quite the same. My heart has its own fracture lines, its own unique ways of breaking. And maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe this calling to celibacy stands in 21st century America as a precious reminder of just how desperately, helplessly devoted we were meant to be to the cross of Christ. A reminder that every sacrifice we make will pale in comparison to the sacrifice made on our behalf. Maybe the problem isn't that faith costs some of us too much, but that it costs all of us too little. So this is a moment where I want to sort of abstract us away from the conversation about same-sex attraction and sexuality for a moment, and just say, I think this principle applies to all of us, regardless of what our experience of sexual attraction is, that all of us are called to ask the question before God, does it cost me? Do I live in such a way that it actually costs me to follow Jesus? Can somebody who doesn't know Jesus look at every component of my life, at the ways that I love people and the ways that I would prefer not to, at how I spend my time and how I spend my money, at the things I hope for and dream of and fear? If somebody who doesn't know Jesus can look at all of those components of my life and then make perfect sense of them without knowing who Jesus is, then it may be that Jesus doesn't actually have as much influence over my life as I thought he did. But if all of this sounds super depressing, I don't want to sort of leave us in that like heavy note, because I'm also a big fan of the word delightful. I'm such a big fan of the word delightful that this one time I set up a meeting with the pastor of my church. His name is Aaron. I set up this meeting with Aaron, and instead of putting my name in the calendar, he just wrote delightful meeting. And then his secretary was looking at his calendar then, and she saw delightful meeting, and she was like, "Oh, I see you have a meeting with Greg. That's nice." So it's sort of like a thing in the community that I live in. Like people just sort of associate me with this word delightful. And in that very delightful meeting with Aaron, that was the conversation where I came out to him, where I told him a lot of the substance of what I've just told you in the last 20 minutes. And at the end of everything that I said, Aaron looked at me and he was like, "You know, Greg," he was like, "you're saying this with a smile, which makes sense because you're delightful. But he said, what you're saying sounds really difficult. And so I'm wondering whether you're really as happy as you seem, or whether you're just good at letting people see what you want them to see. And I told him, I'm happy, and it's a very complicated kind of happy. I want to propose to you this evening that maybe what all of us are called to as followers of Jesus is a complicated kind of happy. There's this wonderful moment in the Gospels. It's so good that it's in all three of the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's in Matthew 19, and then again in Mark 10, and then again in Luke 18. And it's this moment where Peter has just said to Jesus, Jesus, we left everything to follow you. So I just want to know what there's going to be for us since we have given everything up. And I love how Jesus responds to Peter. What he doesn't do is be like, Peter, you idiot, you didn't give up a thing. Now quit whining and go stand over by Thaddeus. Jesus acknowledges that there is real loss, that there really is something given up in order to follow him. But what he says is this. He says, truly, I tell you, there's no one who has left home or fathers or mothers or sisters or brothers or wives or children or fields who will not fail to receive 100 times as much in this life. Homes, fathers, mothers, wives, children, fields, along with persecutions, and in the age to come, eternal life. Right, so Jesus doesn't deny that something is given up in order to follow him. But what he promises is something so much better than everything that we've given up. He promises 100-fold the very same things that we thought we had lost in order to be his disciples. And it's not just a promise for after we die. He's not saying, suffer through your miserable human existence, and then you will die and go to heaven and everything will be better. But he's actually making this testable promise. He's saying, in this lifetime, you'll receive 100-fold the very same things that you thought you had lost. You'll receive 100 times all the family that you could have tried to get by your own power. I want to suggest to you that that's the gamble that all of us need to be taking when we follow Jesus. That there is, by definition, something that we need to be giving up. And yet that the promise that comes with that is that, in fact, Jesus is so much better at meeting our needs. Jesus is so much better at giving us joy than we are at getting it for ourselves, than we are at meeting our own needs. So that brings us more or less, with a few twists and turns along the way, that brings us more or less up to the present, in which I live in this sort of weird, awkward middle space, neither gay affirming nor ex-gay, but still seeking to follow Jesus as well as I can figure out how in the moment. So I want us to turn from there with that little biographical background, and I want to just offer you a few definitions of terms and a few thoughts that I think might be helpful to kind of lay the groundwork then for our Q&A. So I'll give you a couple definitions and 5 brief postulates. These won't be like 5 sermon points. It's not like, oh boy, let's sit down for the long haul. It should be fairly brief. We're getting toward the end here, so prepare your questions, send them to Nadia, ready yourself for a conversation. But a few things that I want to give us to sort of categorize, to place in our mind. 4 terms that I want to define for you: sexual attraction, sexual orientation, sexual identity, and sexual practice. So first of all, we have sexual attraction. This is what a person experiences internally even before they have words for it. So you are sitting in a room, and someone sits down beside you, and you feel the butterflies in your stomach. You don't need to have a name for the butterflies. You don't need to have asked for the butterflies, but there the butterflies are. This is what we call attraction, sexual attraction. Then we have a category called sexual orientation. And by orientation, people mean an enduring pattern of emotional, romantic, and or sexual attraction. So basically, if over time I notice, hey, every time I get the butterflies, it is another guy. And even though I would be delighted to have the butterflies for a nice young lady, that never happens. And this is persistent over the course of time. Then I would say, okay, this is what our language calls orientation, the sort of persistent attraction over time. Then we have sexual identity. And this is a person's self-understanding and self-expression of their attraction and their orientation. In other words, this is how people think about their experience and how they talk about their experience. And note that those are two different things. Like, you can think about it in your head and never say a word and still have an internal sense of sexual identity. But you can also express. Both of those things fall under the heading of identity. And last but not least, we get to sexual practice. And this is what a person actually does about their experience of attraction, about the persistence of that attraction over time, about the language that they use inside and outside of their heads to think about it. So in this last category under sexual practice, I'm going to stick both lust and actual physical sexual behavior, because both of those things have to do with our response to attraction, right? In the moment that I notice I'm attracted to somebody, I'm not immediately lusting. Lust has to do with how we respond to attraction when we experience it. So sexual practice is what we do about our sexuality when we encounter it. So let me offer, by way of postulate, five important distinctions here. First of all, sexual practice is always a choice. Right, I always have, there may be circumstances that make me more or less inclined to respond to my attraction in certain ways, but I always have a choice about how I choose to steward my mind and how I choose to steward my body. So I have a choice. There's no moment at which I'm like, I just can't help lusting. It's just automatic. No, lust is part of the choice that we make, and any physical sexual behavior that we engage in is also part of the choice that we make. So sexual practice is a choice. Sexual attraction and sexual orientation are never choices. Attraction is, by definition, something that we don't have control over, and orientation is just the persistence of that experience over time. Again, we can try to make choices to put ourselves in certain contexts that we hope will change the experience of our attraction. And some people will report changes in their attraction over time, though generally, almost without fail, those shifts in attraction or orientation happen when people are not trying to make them happen. So ex-gay ministries have generally been nearly 0% effective in actually having people who really, really wanted to change their orientation experience meaningful change in their orientation. Sometimes people do experience shifts, but they don't have much control over it. So that's distinction number one. Distinction number two, sexual identity. So sexual practice is always a choice. Sexual attraction and orientation are never choices. Sexual identity both is and is not a choice. And here's what I mean by that. Sexual identity is a choice in the sense that we get to pick what words we use. So for instance, if you've noticed over the course of this evening together so far, I have sometimes used the language of gay. I've sometimes used the language of same-sex attracted. Sometimes I have just sort of described to you more or less what was going on in my life. Those are all different ways of talking about my experience. And I got to pick them, right? We get to pick the words that we use about ourselves. But society picks the repertoire of words that we have available to think or speak with. So I can't just make up a new word for you, right? Like I've been repeatedly referring to the joke of calling my parents pineapples, because I said that I would not refer to them as the M word while we were recording this conversation. So we sort of constructed, but I can't just go out into the world and be like, let me tell you about my parents, the pineapples. Why? Because nobody else agreed with me that that was a thing, right? Nobody knows what that is. So when it comes to language, we don't just get to make up our own language. We're stuck with the linguistic options that are available to us in the world around us. And we get to choose whether we want to lie to ourselves and to others, or whether we want to tell the truth to ourselves and to others, or whether we want to say nothing at all to ourselves or others. But we don't get to choose, if we do choose to speak, and we do choose to speak truthfully, we don't get to choose what language we use. So there is, in some Christian circles, there's sort of a grand debate about whether it's okay to call yourself gay, whether you should only exclusively call yourself same-sex attracted. Thoughtful people disagree on this question. My dear friend Rachel Gilson and I have, in a variety of contexts, done public debates with each other because she does not prefer to use the word gay for herself. She prefers the term same-sex attracted. She has concerns about the word gay. I have concerns about the word same-sex attracted, and so I prefer the word gay. She and I are happy to dialogue about that. And again, we can talk about that dynamic more if you want. Like if you're like, oh, I have many questions, by all means, Q&A is coming. But the point for now is just to say, like, so we can disagree about which language is better, but we sort of have to acknowledge, like, well, that's kind of the language available to us. So if we're going to talk about it at all, and if we're going to talk about it honestly, like, we'll pick from among the language we've got to describe it. Distinction number 3. So attraction and orientation are not sinful, but they are products of the fall. Anytime that we're attracted or oriented to something other than lifelong loving opposite-sex monogamy or celibacy, we're showing that we have a sin nature. Right. So here's what I mean by this. If you have within you over the course of time an experience that you are repeatedly tempted to lust after other people, whether that's people of the same sex or people of the opposite sex, the capacity to lust willy-nilly after all kinds of people is not the way that God originally intended for us to be in the Garden of Eden. Why? Because sexuality is created to be stewarded either within the context of marriage or within the context of celibacy, and anything outside of those two categories is already inherently fallen. So when I say that sexual attraction and sexual orientation are fallen, that they are a result of the fall, I'm not just saying for gay people, I'm saying for all people. If you are human, congratulations, you are enrolled in the fallenness of sexuality. None of us are quite what we were designed to be. Welcome to the party. It's hopping. So all of us together get to have this wrestling with, okay, how do we wrestle with the nature of our attraction, what we do about it? Distinction number 4, note that attraction and orientation are different than specific experiences of temptation. So being same-sex oriented, being gay, as I would say, doesn't mean that you're constantly experiencing sexual temptation. So for instance, if you are exclusively opposite sex attracted, and you would say, anytime I do experience attraction, it's for somebody of the opposite sex. That doesn't mean, I assume for most of you, it doesn't mean that at all times you are always actively experiencing attraction, or you are always actively experiencing the temptation to lust right now at this very moment. So example, for me, I mean, there are a number of very handsome men on the call. Congratulations to you all. You look lovely. But at the moment, I am not experiencing any attraction or any temptation to lust after you. It's not personal. It's not you. It's me. But the fact that categorically, if I were to experience attraction, I can say, like, it would be attraction to a guy. I know that from, just over the course of my life, that's how it tends to work out. But that doesn't mean that at any given moment, I'm just like, I just can't help it. So you understand, there's a distinction between, like, this is the way that I experience attraction when I experience attraction. and I am actively experiencing attraction at this very moment. So be clear to make that distinction. Useful stuff, people. And finally, number 5, and then remember, this is the last thing I'm going to say before we turn to Q&A. So I hope you've been dropping those cues. Number 5, is possible for somebody to disagree with my sexual practice, but to still respect me in a way that affirms my identity and my personhood, right? So if somebody says to me like, hey, Greg, I think that the ways that you're making choices with respect to, how you steward your mind and your body with your sexuality, I don't know that I would make the same choices you're making. As a follower of Jesus, my conviction is that Jesus calls me to something different than that. But I still love and respect you. It's very easy for me to hear that. If somebody disagrees with my sexual identity, so for instance, if somebody says, oh, you call yourself gay, that's bad. I am more likely to hear that not as them talking about sexual behavior, but to hear that as them talking about sexual attraction and sexual orientation. So for instance, when somebody says to me, being gay is a sin, I don't usually think automatically, oh, they're trying to tell me that having same-sex sexual intercourse is a sin. What I feel like they are saying is, Greg, you are a sin. Greg, God designed you in such a way that there's really no hope for you. He just can't wait to throw you in hell because of this thing that feels very unchosen, that feels as natural as your eye color. So we need to be really careful in how we invoke the language of sexual identity, how we talk about gay people, about LGBTQ people, because often, especially in conservative Christian circles, we think that we're talking about sexual behavior, but what people hear us talking about is sexual attraction or sexual orientation. So it's really, really critical that we make that distinction well. On that note, I have nothing else to say, but hopefully I have said enough things that I have sparked one or two possibly interesting, possibly controversial things that we wish to discuss further. And again, remember, this is a space in which it's okay if at the end of the evening we do not all agree with each other. I'm not sending out some sort of statement that you need to sign on the dotted line at the end of this, but let us see if we can explore in productive ways some useful and wise things, perhaps, going forward. So, turning it over to you.
Before we get into questions, can you guys hear me? Yes, okay. Greg, you said something earlier on that I thought was a little unfair to yourself. You said, set the expectations low, and I had high expectations. And Greg, you blew me out of the water. I really appreciate what you shared tonight. I think it was so, like, what an answer to prayer, man. Thank you so much. And I wanted to interrupt you like 3 times saying, wow, what a powerful point. What a good word. Particularly really appreciate the clarity that you bring to this issue. And I really appreciate the way you talk about the cross, man. It's made me want to just order your book right now on Amazon. Well done, dude. And same goes for my brother here. So well done. I just want to affirm and encourage you, man, and really say thank you. Now I saw a question pop up, and I'm going to mute myself again, but I couldn't hold on any longer. I just had to say thanks again, brother.
Oh, thanks, Caleb. I appreciate that.
So, Greg, can you see the chats?
I've been ignoring the chats, but I can stop ignoring the chats. Oh, look, somebody wrote Adichie's name. Yes, bravo, well done.
The first question. Yeah, go for it.
The one in here, the one about terminology.
Yeah.
Is that okay, beautiful. Let me, since I'm so tech savvy, I'm actually gonna pop a link in there, but I'll talk while I'm doing it so you won't be bored sitting here waiting for me. I'm going to pop a link in there to so Rachel Gilson and I, one of the contexts in which we've had this conversation with each other was a back and forth blog conversation. So I will just post the link to the first of those blogs. And then if you want later, you can read the whole party. But let me summarize for you in brief a few points on both sides of the conversation that I think are helpful to keep in mind. So both of us broadly would say there are three main things that we need to keep in mind when we pick language for ourselves. We need to think about how it interacts with the world on mission. We need to think about how it interacts with the church, with fellow believers, and we need to think about how it interacts with ourselves, how our language shapes the way that we think about ourselves and what that means. So on the question of mission, I would say, well, I'll summarize my arguments better than I'll summarize Rachel's, because just inherently, it's the nature of my bias. I'll attempt to give you both sides fairly, but you should really just go and read the thing. But on the point of mission, we would both acknowledge, look, there's some complexity here. I would say the most common word when I step outside the walls of the church and I'm trying to say to somebody, I experience attraction exclusively to people of the same sex, most people outside the church would say, like, okay, so the word for that is gay. So what you're saying is you're gay. And I think there's usefulness in using that language, especially because so many people, especially so many LGBTQ people, so many gay people, have gotten the impression, whether because they actually heard it from Christians or just because they heard a rumor that this was what the Christians thought, that being gay means that God hates you and you're going to hell. And they think that means, oh, if you are attracted to the same sex, then you are, God hates you and you're going to hell. And because that false perception exists, I think there's actually a lot of power in recognizing that it exists and saying to somebody, hey, actually, that's false. Actually, I'm in the same boat as you. I'm also attracted to the same sex. And yet, I love Jesus. Jesus loves me. I get to be on mission with Jesus. And so I think there can be some purposefulness in us using the language that's most understandable to the people around us in order to communicate the gospel as clearly as possible to them. Now, Rachel would argue, like, well, same-sex attraction also communicates decently clearly. And, you know, it's weird, but that's fine. And I would say, well, I don't think it communicates as well. But so that's kind of where we are on the mission question. On the question of the church, generally in church spaces, if you call yourself gay, you're treated with a bit of it makes people a little uncomfortable. And I'm just at this point, I'm just kind of used to it. But the reality is, there are church contexts where Rachel can go in, she can tell her story, she can call herself same-sex attracted, and it doesn't raise certain red flags for people. And so she's able to speak to a group of people within church contexts that I usually get dismissed out of hand. Like, as soon as people hear that I'm gay, they're like, well, he obviously has nothing good to say. So in that sense, same-sex attracted for Rachel, it sort of works better as a way to get into church communities. I would say, on the other hand, there can be some merit in using language that is appropriately disruptive. Right, so I mean appropriately disruptive in the sense that when Jesus goes into the temple and finds the money changers and is like, there's bad stuff going on in here, let me flip some tables. Walking into an evangelical church and calling oneself gay is sort of the linguistic equivalent of like flipping some tables. Like, it causes a little bit of distress, a little bit of crisis. And I think sometimes when there are problems in the church that need to be addressed, it can be good to cause a little bit of crisis. It's sort of like pulling a fire alarm, right? If there's something going on, and I would say there are some problems in the church. The way that the church has historically handled these issues around same-sex sexuality is pretty bad. And I say that with deep love for the church. This is not me hating on the church. I'm a big fan. But I think I love the church enough to want to see the church be better. And so I'm okay with causing a little scandal if causing a little scandal means that ultimately we're all forced to reckon with what it would look like for us to follow Jesus better. That's a gamble that's worth it to me. But last and not least, and arguably the most significant and sort of hot button part of this question is, what does it do to our vision of the self? Another thing I should note to you is that the history of both terms. So the term same-sex attracted is born out of the ex-gay movement. And the thinking behind it, right before the ex-gay movement happened, it was perfectly normal to just say gay, or before that, homosexual was kind of the preferred term. That was just what you called everybody. C.S. Lewis of Chronicles of Narnia fame, once described somebody who was in my position, somebody who was attracted to the same sex and was celibate. He referred to him as a pious male homosexual. So for Lewis, it was like, yeah, homosexual just means he's attracted to the same sex, and pious means that he is choosing to follow Jesus in celibacy. But the ex-gay movement came along and they said, we want to make more of a big deal about terminology because they wanted to talk about sexual orientation as something more fleeting, something that would go away more easily. So that they could say, like, no, like, you will not stay this way. Like, you're not gay. You're temporarily gay, right? You're not gay. You just happen to be experiencing some same-sex attraction. So the idea was that you use language that makes it sound like this can go away quickly. So one of the reasons that I strongly don't prefer the term same-sex attracted is because of some of the damage that was done by the ex-gay movement, the message that was communicated to people that said, if you really love Jesus and Jesus really loves you, you will become straight. And then the people who did not become straight ended up feeling like God had abandoned them. I had a dear friend in grad school who his parents sent him to ex-gay ministry when he was a young teenager and came out to them, and he ended up slitting his wrists in a church basement because he was so convinced that he needed to be straight in order for God to love him, and he wasn't. So I have in my head those sorts of narratives, the reality of what can go wrong when we lie to people about what they need to experience in order to be loved by God. And recognizing that a number of other gay people in the world also have that narrative in mind, I'm very cautious of that language. But on the other hand, Rachel is cautious of the term gay because she's concerned that for some people, it can become sort of too large a part of their self-conception. Right? So in the same way that if you tell yourself over and over again, oh, I'm just so stupid. I'm just so stupid. Oh, I'm such a stupid person. The more you say that to yourself and the more you believe that about yourself, the more you tend to act like someone who is stupid. Right? This is sort of an established psychological phenomenon. Is like the things that you speak over yourself or the things that other people speak over you tend to become the ways that you live in the world. And so one of Rachel's concerns is if we reinforce for ourselves a narrative that says, I am gay, this is who I am, this is a significant part of me, then it becomes too large a part of our story. It sort of overtakes Jesus as the primary part of our identity, or it can. To which I would say that that's a worthy concern. I think all of us have the capacity, regardless of whether we're straight or gay, regardless of whether we are, regardless of what language we use to describe whatever our experience of sexuality is, all of us have the capacity to make our sexuality too totalizing a part of who we are. We all keep trying to put other idols in place of Jesus as the Lord of our lives. And so I think we always need to be cautious. So I want to be as cautious with the word gay as I am with anything else. But unlike Rachel, I don't see the term gay itself being exclusive in having that danger. I think all language has that danger. I think being human has that danger. I think as long as we are human, our hearts are prone to wander. Lord, I feel it, as the hymn writer says. So I think it's good for all of us to be sort of constantly cautioning each other. Anyway, that was a longer than you needed narrative of the terminology debate, but there you have it. Oh, bring it on, Eva.
I'm kind of curious. It's completely random, but what is LGBT, whatever that is that you keep mentioning?
Yes. Thank you yeah. That acronym LGBTQ, and sometimes you'll see it written with the plus, or you'll see other letters after the Q. But that is, it's an acronym that stands for several words. So the L stands for lesbian, the G stands for gay. Gay can mean somebody of any gender, but most often means gay men. Lesbian is exclusively women who are attracted to the same sex. You've got bisexual is the B of LGB, and that's people who are attracted to both sexes. The T there stands for transgender, which introduces a whole separate set of topics around gender identity, which I'm also happy to talk about with you, but that might get us slightly afield from the current conversation about sexuality. The Q stands for queer, which can mean a whole bunch of things. Broadly, queer means not fitting tidily into societal norms of sexuality or gender identity. So queer, often you'll hear it get used as sort of a catch-all term, but there are some people who would probably be lesbian, gay, or bisexual in our nomenclature, but they would prefer to say like, I just, I don't really care so much about the gender of the person. I just more like, I fall in love with the person and I didn't even notice what gender they are. That person might identify as Q, as queer. And there's a whole host of labels that go beyond, or letters that go beyond that represent other sort of sub-identities. Basically, as people have tried to get more specific about saying, okay, here's my exact experience of sexual attraction as it looks over time, they've started inventing more and more precise words to describe that experience of attraction over time. But yeah, so LGBTQ or LGBT plus is just a term that folks who identify as one of those things will often use to try to say like anybody who's not totally just attracted to the same sex or does not totally identify with their birth gender or is in some other way not quite what society used to refer to as normal. We sort of invented this this label to kind of identify those people together. But there's important distinctions within them. I hope that's helpful.
Okay, cool. That's interesting.
I've got a few questions that came in to me, and I'm pretty much just gonna, Greg, I'm just gonna read them the way they wrote them.
Cool.
All right, so when was the first time you realized that you had a sexual attraction to guys? And was it when you were 12, like the example that you gave, or was it later before that?
It was around 12. And it was definitely, it definitely took me a long time to go from like individual moments of attraction to sort of having enough of those to piece together and be like, oh, I think I might be gay. Oh dear. Because at first it was just like, oh, yeah, I didn't, is that weird? Because when you're going through puberty, well, I don't know what you guys felt like going through puberty, but like everything is weird, right? Puberty is just a weird time. So it's like a lot of weird things happen. And you're like, I don't know how I'm supposed to explain that. I think my first conscious memories actually of feeling like, oh, I think I'm attracted to guys was when I was reading books. I remember that I was kind of a literature nerd. I also have a PhD in English, if that gives you any sense for like what a literature nerd I am. So even at a young age, I would be reading books and there would be parts where like there was a dreamy guy and I would be like, oh my gosh, he's so dreamy. And I remember being like, is that a normal way to read books? That seems like not the way other guys talk about reading books. I'm not sure. But yeah, I was around 12. I think I was 13 or 14 when I first said to my brother, John, I think I'm gay. Yeah, to which he then said, no, you're not. You can't be gay. And I was like, oh, okay, good to know. And then didn't talk about it to anybody else for like 10 years. But there was that one moment when I was 14 when I said it out loud. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll pause in between questions to give people who don't want to like send it into me a chance to just say their question if they want. But the next one is, from your experience, do you believe that if you had grown up in a foreign country or society where there was no biblical or Western teaching concerning homosexuality, would there be any natural conscience related conviction about your attraction? And then in parentheses, they're asking, I'm asking this because I feel like there's a difference between what's specifically called right or wrong in the Old Testament, like food restrictions, sacrifices, etc., and what our Western culture condemns as moral failure.
Yeah. So that's a super interesting question. And I think, I mean, it's so hard for any of us to disentangle our conscience from growing up in a world where there are consciences and where we have a sense of right and wrong. I think my sense is
Dollar store. There's some in the garage, in the drawer. Oh,
my sense is there's some in the garage, but also my sense is that there's a moment in Romans 1 where I don't think it's a dumb question at all. There's a moment in Romans 1 where shoot. Is it, now I'm saying it is Romans 1. Sorry, I'm second guessing myself over here. Where the author of Romans is saying that when people who don't have the law live as if they had the law, they act as a law unto themselves. Their conscience is now accusing and now even defending them. Now I'm doubting whether it's Romans 1 or not again. I could look it up. I'll look it up later. But it's in there somewhere though. And I think there's a sense in which our consciences, God communicates to us via our hearts in ways that are really hard to name. And so even though there's definitely a part of me that I think if no one had ever told me, Greg, this is not what you should be doing, this is how you should be living, even if no one had ever told me that, I think my heart would experience very differently the temptation that I experience toward lust after the same sex. My heart experiences it in a certain kind of way. It feels appealing, but like appealing in a slightly gross kind of way. You know, like when you have a craving for junk food and you're like, I really want to eat junk food. And you also, there's some part of your body that's like vaguely aware, like, this is junk food. I'm going to feel gross later, but like, I know I want it, but like, you don't need somebody necessarily. It helps to have your parents tell you like, that's junk food. This is why you feel crappy afterwards. Like that makes it easier to recognize. And yet there's something built into your body also that tells you, junk food, but I want it, you know? And I think for me, the difference between when I'm following Jesus obediently and like Jesus and I are just having a ball together, that feels really good in a certain kind of way, in like a holy and delightful good kind of way. There's also a feels really good when I'm just going headlong into lust. It also feels good, but it feels good in like a junk foody kind of way. And I think whether or not I was given words to describe that difference, some part of my soul would know that there was a difference.
Like think about it, but there's a sense of kind of foreboding in the background, foreboding feeling in the background of your thoughts or whatever.
Yeah. I think my body and my soul, which is sort of wrapped up into my body in ways that I don't exactly understand. My soul knows things because God has placed things there. It was Romans 2. No wonder Romans 1 didn't feel quite right. A chapter off. Rookie error, Coles, rookie error. Anyway, he has placed eternity into the hearts of human beings. That passage says. So there's a sense in which God puts eternity into us. He sort of gives us information that we don't know in any other way except because God has placed it inside of us. But it is really hard, I think, to disentangle that from what we're told, what we see in the world around us, which is, I think, part of why we need scripture, we need wise people in our lives helping us disentangle what we feel and experience naturally, and sort out which of this is Jesus and which is not. Hopefully that begins to answer the question asker.
Okay, the next one I have is, I know that some people claim that their sexual and romantic orientation are different. For example, a man that's sexually straight but romantically bi. What's your view on this?
So when we talk about romance, I think there's a recognition in society that maybe sometimes we've cast the net of romance pretty wide. Like we've called a lot of things romance, and maybe not all of them necessarily belong within a sexual romantic relationship, right? So like, is it romance if I just want to be with a person a lot? Is it romance if I want to share an ice cream sundae? Is it romance if I want to put my hand on your knee as we stare off into the sunset? Is it romance if we cuddle during a movie? Like there's a question of like where the line is drawn. And the reason that we end up with, how many of you are familiar with the term bromance? Right, when the bros get romantic, right? And the idea here is like, if we draw the boundaries of romance so wide and we say like, all this is romance, this all belongs in the relationship that you're also having sex in, then all of a sudden it turns out that there's very little left to do in the relationships that you're not having sex in. And so the thought is like, oh, the only kind of meaningful intimacy that you can have is in a relationship that is also a sexual relationship. So I'm inclined to be a little bit suspicious of the category of romance generally. I would say, I think if something leads you toward, like we're kissing, and now the longer we kiss, the more we just feel like, yeah, let's carry on with our clothes off. You know, like maybe we need to draw a line there. You know, but the question of where those lines are drawn. I think there's a whole lot of stuff that is actually good and right for us to do with people who we don't need to be romantic with. We certainly don't need to be sexual with, but it's appropriate for us to have deep and intimate friendship with people. So I would say if you feel like you are romantically drawn to people of a different sex than you're sexually drawn to, maybe you can make some really great friends. The question of where that boundary ought to be drawn, like where is it romance that can only exist in a sexual relationship versus romance that really should just be friendship activities anyway. I don't know that any society has satisfactorily drawn for us the line between those things. But when people say, sometimes I want to be romantic to somebody who I don't really have any desire to be sexual with, I would say, yeah, maybe that's because we've called so many things romance that now we feel like the only meaningful friendships have to be romances. And for the record, we see all kinds of relationships in the Bible that are definitely not sexual, but also seem to have this very romantic quality. King David of the Old Testament says of his friend Jonathan, "Your love for me was better than the love of women," which is like a pretty romantic line if I ever heard one. But this is not to say that like David and Jonathan are getting frisky together. You know, the point is just that like David and Jonathan are really, really, really good friends, and they have a category for this really, really, really good friendship. So that is at least one thing that I would say about that idea of being biromantic, for instance. Oh, a question has come into me. Are you not able to have roommates with other guys, or does it not affect you? This is an excellent question. I am able to be roommates with guys. I generally find, I mean, so my roommates and I, we don't tend to just like run around in the nude on the regular. I don't know what you all and your roommates are up to, but like that's not normal for me and my roommates. We're not like having naked Tuesday noodle parties, you know, like I don't know. It's just like we sleep in the same room, you know. So that in itself is not scandalous to me. I do think it's appropriate to ask wise questions about like, hey, if I am very attracted to a specific person, as it happens, I'm not at all attracted to my roommate. Again, no offense to him. It's not him, it's me. So that works out fine. I would maybe, if somebody were like, yeah, so I have this roommate and I'm also madly like crushing on him hardcore, you know, and he loves to change in front of me all the time. I would be like, maybe we need to talk about a different roommate situation for you for like a variety of reasons. But I don't think inherently it's like once you're gay, you can't have any same-sex roommates ever again. Yeah, but sometimes it's complicated. But hey, that's life. Sometimes life is complicated.
That relates to a question that I had of, it can be different with different people in different friend groups, but changing in front of one another at sleepovers or summer camps where you're in a cabin of girls and things like that. When you're all straight and it literally doesn't matter and you don't care, you've grown up together, it doesn't really bring in that sexual aspect of it. But if there's someone in the group who is same-sex attracted or gay, whether they're Christian or not Christian, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think, so my first thought actually is I generally encourage people to act as if there is somebody who is gay or same-sex attracted present, even if you think there isn't. Because right now we live in a world where the sort of default assumption is that we think everybody's straight until we are informed to the contrary. Sometimes I've like gone places to speak, you know, there'll be like 50 people and they'll be like, yeah, you know, we're all straight here, but like some of us have friends. And I'll be like, there's 50 of you and you're all straight. That's sort of a statistical anomaly, isn't it though? And you know, so the reality, and then, you know, invariably somebody will come up to me later and be like, I haven't told anyone yet, but I'm not straight. And so I always encourage people like, act as if people are present before you know that they are. Assume that they are. And part of why I think that's really valuable is because you don't want to put yourself in a situation where once somebody comes out, you feel the need to like radically change everything that you do. Like, well, I was acting really, you know, I was acting like everything was just natural and we were good friends. And then you came out and now all of a sudden I'm like on eggshells around you and it's super awkward. The easiest way to not put yourself in that situation is to just assume from the get-go, one of these people might not be straight, and I already want to act in a way as if I'm honoring them, as if they were present. I mean, when it comes to the specific question about like changing, I think, I mean, honestly, like if you're changing is just like, I took off a pair of things, I put on a new pair of things, that's not particularly scandalous. I mean, you know, and maybe the path of better wisdom is like, I went into a more private corner and did that. But it's, again, I hope that your changing is not like, I'm doing a striptease every time I get into my swimsuit. Like maybe, you know, maybe keep it appropriate. And I say that kind of jokingly, and yet, my freshman year of college, so I went to a Christian school for my undergrad degree, and I was in an all-boys dorm. And it was an all-boys dorm where people acted as if everyone was straight, as if all the hundreds of boys who lived in this boys' dorm were straight. And so they would do things like catcall each other, you know, and like skateboard naked and slap each other on the butt and pretend to make sexual advances on each other, and things that made me super uncomfortable. And the hilarity of it, like the whole joke of the matter was like, because we're all very straight, of course, and none of us cares about this at all. And I was like, this is very awkward for me. So don't do that. But I think if you interact in a way that reflects your desire to honor, if somebody is if somebody is feeling a sense of attraction and trying to be respectful about that, as long as you're being discreet and they're choosing to be discreet, I think you can sort of gauge situation by situation. I think what's wisest there. I wouldn't want to make a categorical rule.
That's pretty perfect for another question I got. Just to like lead into it, which is, one of my gay friends told me that they had a crush on me. How do I lovingly handle that?
Ooh, I think tip number one, don't freak out. I mean, I often tell this to when gay people write me and they're like, I have a crush on my friend. What do I do? I tell them the same thing, like, don't freak out. A crush is a crush, you know, you get over it, you move on with life. I think don't freak out. I would encourage you to try to continue on in relationship with that person in a way that in a way that invites them to let you know what's going to be helpful for them. So if somebody reveals that they have a crush on you and it turns out that like you used to spend all this one-on-one time together, and now that they have a crush on you, it's just incredibly hard. And they're like, I might need a little space in this relationship, or it might be more helpful for me if we just hang out in larger groups. I think to honor that is really good. But on the other hand, don't assume that people need that. Don't be like, you have a crush on me, therefore I will do you a favor and get out of your life. Because I think that the ideal end game is that you both carry on in a way that's honoring of one another. You both recognize, okay, this is not a thing that's going to happen. And then on the other side of that, you are better friends for having gone through that experience together and still loving each other through it in appropriate ways. So I would say be open to that person helping you understand how to love them well in the midst of it, how to respect them well in the midst of it. And certainly, I wouldn't try to do things that make their life harder. Like if they're like, I have a crush on you, don't like start joking about it all the time or start, making fake advances on them. Please, no. But also don't pull out of their lives, because I think that can make people feel kind of like a leper, right? Like, as soon as you knew the truth, as soon as I let you see the real me, you withdrew from my life. I think that's the exact opposite of what Jesus does for people, which is as he sees them, he really leans into relationship with them.
I'd say that I definitely think that that's a really good explanation of what you said, but I think that it's probably also that advice is probably also a good advice for even situations where the person that likes you isn't necessarily the same sex as you. They might be different.
Oh yeah. Oh, that's an excellent point. Yes, if somebody of the opposite sex has a crush on you,
you guys could still hang out. You don't get all weird about.
Yeah. Yeah, if somebody of the opposite sex turns out to have a crush on you, you should also not cut them out of your life. Just a general recommendation. Unless they ask you to.
So what like go ahead, sorry, Judith.
Okay. So I was gonna say, how would you respond or do when you know Christians who think that being gay or like that's not something like that's okay and that the Bible's okay with, like the Bible says it's fine? How would you respond to things like that?
Yeah. So that's a great question. Depending on how close my relationship with them is, I mean, if it's somebody who I don't really know that well, then the first thing I would be trying to discern is like, when they say they're a Christian, what do they mean by that? Because I think some of us by Christian, and I think I hope that when we say we're Christians, we mean something like, I believe Jesus is the savior of the universe, and in following him, that means that all of my life is given over to him, that I, in the way that I would run my own life, no longer exist. I have died to myself, and I now live for Jesus. That's what I mean when I say Christian. But I know a lot of people who, when they say Christian, mean something very different, in which Jesus has sort of like a cameo role in my life, like, Jesus makes an appearance now and again, he really spices up my wardrobe. If that's the point of our difference, then I'm a lot less interested in talking about sexual ethics with that person and much more interested in talking about who Jesus is. That's always my first priority. Who is Jesus? Is he actually the Lord of your life? Does he actually have permission to ask you to do anything? And if somebody says, yes, Jesus is Lord of my life, he has permission to do and to ask me to do anything, then I would say, well, okay, where are we getting our information about what he's calling you to do? How much do we trust the Bible? And sometimes what I discover is at that point, somebody will say, okay, yeah, totally trust Jesus, but I don't trust the Bible. So at that point, again, if we have an argument about sexual ethics, my understanding of sexual ethics is so rooted in what the Bible says that there's really no productive conversation we can have about sexual ethics until we first agree on what the Bible says. So first, I want to talk about who Jesus is. Is he worth following? Second, I want to talk about the Bible. Why do we trust the Bible? Why do I believe that the Bible is the word of God given to me to help me discern what Jesus is calling me to? Once we agree on Jesus and we agree on the Bible, if we still disagree about sexual ethics at that point, then I'm finally ready to have sort of a more specific textual conversation, right? This is a conversation about things like that Greek word arsenokoitai and the reasons why we might be dubious of it, but the reasons why we might actually think that is what's going on. I would want to have a conversation with them about what Jesus means when he uses the Greek word porneia. I would want to have a conversation with them about the creation of male and female in Genesis 1 and 2, about what it means when Jesus, in his description of marriage in the Gospel of Matthew, says, haven't you heard that in the beginning the Creator created them male and female, and for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and become united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. The fact that Jesus himself seems to define marriage as being fundamentally rooted in maleness and femaleness coming together. Then I'm ready to talk about those things. But those things are only things that I talk about with people I know well, who care about my opinion, and who I already agree with about Jesus and the Bible. So I do sometimes have that conversation, but I usually have that conversation once I think that conversation will actually get us somewhere productive. Does that make sense? Sweet.
Greg, how much more time we got with you?
If we got a few more questions, I'm still raring to go. It's only 9:33. Yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah. Because there are several, but I don't want to keep you longer than.
Bring it. I'll try to be fast. Maybe by 9:4. Well, I'll try to be fast. Keep them coming. Keep them coming, Nadia.
Okay. All right. Here we go. This one says, I was wondering if you had anything that you think affected your sexuality, or you
like
were
in terms
just born.
Like why I turned out to be gay. Yeah. Okay. So this is a fascinating question. So the question of, this is what's called the etiology. Etiology is like where a thing comes from. The etiology of same-sex sexuality is a really fascinating discussion. And you'll find people who will say very categorically, like, it's all nurture. It's all just about things that happen to you after you were born. And some people who say categorically, like, it's all nature. It's all genetics. And once you come out of the womb, it's determined. Now, the reality, I hate to inform you, is neither of those things. The reality is that it seems to be this really complex combination of the two of them. So we know that it's not 100% genetics, that there does need to be some kind of factor in upbringing because of some really fascinating identical twin studies. So you have identical twins who have the exact same genetic material who if they're raised in different places, will be more likely to both turn out gay or both turn out straight, but not 100% likely, which means there's some genetic component, but the genetics can't be everything. There's studies that show that the more sons a woman has, the more likely her next son is to be gay. So the more older brothers you have, statistically, the more likely you are to be gay, which is fascinating. I have 2 older brothers. Occasionally, when I'm in sort of a spicy mood, I'll tell my brothers that I blame them that I'm gay. I'm mostly joking. So there's some genetic component there, but the genetics can't be everything, just based on the studies that we have. I think, so for me, the question of like how it happened, how we got here, isn't super important to me, because the reality is we're here and God doesn't seem to be super interested in changing it. So at this point, the interesting question, the question that I get to answer and the question that I want to answer is like, what do I do about it now? What does it look like for me to live faithfully now? And what does it look like for me to encourage other people to live faithfully now? But I think, yeah, as the question of etiology, the nature versus nurture debate, I think the best science would say it's some of both. And that doesn't freak me out. That doesn't worry me. Again, as I said, I think all of us are fallen when it comes to the nature of our sexuality. So I don't think of myself as like an extra broken straight person. I don't think that like, oh, if things had gone really well, I would have turned out straighter, and then I would have been holier. I think the reality is, hey, we're all kind of broken. We're definitely broken. We all get to figure out what redemption looks like. So yeah, it doesn't wreck my faith if there are both genetic and environmental factors in my experience of sexuality. Great question. Bring them on. Let's hear another, Nadia.
Okay, here's one. Okay, what truth did God use to bring contentment into your life as you were choosing to commit to celibacy?
Ooh, oh, this is such a great question. I think one of there was a time in my life when I thought about celibacy, I thought like, celibacy. It means that I will live alone for the rest of my life. It means that I will never have really deeply intimate relationships because I always see those portrayed as marital relationships. It means that I'll never be super involved in the lives of young kids and get to see them grow up and be part of their development. It means that I'll never feel like I have a really good safety net in my life if I lose my job or something bad happens or I get really sick. Basically, it means that I'm condemned to a life of solitude. And I was like, that's super depressing. That is the worst. But it took a while for God to sort of start to change my heart on that, to realize that actually none of those things are part of God's vision for singleness. And this, by the way, this is true about like all the single people, right? Like gay single people, yes. Straight single people, also yes. Some of you, maybe straight, may want to get married and may still find yourself never married. In fact, at the conference where I met Nadia and Caleb, there was this delightful woman I met who was probably in her 50s, had never been married, and had wanted to for a long time, and then eventually realized that God was saying like, no, actually, there's stuff that I want you to do that you're going to do for me better as a single person. And it was just so terrific to see the way she had leaned into that and the way that God had really used her as a result of that. But the cool thing, and I loved talking with her because both of us were exchanging the same story, which is the story of realizing that when you are single in the kingdom of God, you actually have this massive family. Not just family in like a sort of abstract, like we're all the family of God, and that's why we see each other once per week at church and maybe schedule an occasional coffee date, but otherwise live very separate lives. Not that kind of like family in name only, but like family who's like interlocking lives. Like, we live together, we eat together, we do life together. I have this family I'm super close with in State College. They've got 2 boys named Max and Grant who are 13 and 10 respectively, but I met them when they were 6 and 3. And so over the course of the last 7 years, as I've been part of their lives, we've moved from the time when Max's arms still like wrapped around my knees to now like Grant's hair is at the underside of my chin, and I teach them big words. So that like I taught them the difference between the word sanguine, which means cheerful, and sanguinary, which means bloodthirsty. And then every time I would see Max for like 6 months, when he was like 8 maybe, every time I would see him, I would be like, Max, are you feeling more sanguine or sanguinary? And he would be like, sanguinary, and then try to bite my arm. I became part of their lives. And so this one time I was over at their house, because I'm over at their house a lot, and Grant was like, Greg, Max and I were talking, and we can't decide if you're more like a brother or like a crazy uncle. And Max was like, yeah, like Uncle Greg sounds weird. And he was like, but you'd be a really older brother. And I don't really know what the word is for that relationship either. I was like, I don't have a word for it either, guys. But there is this sense in which like whatever we have going on, it's something more than just people who happen to occasionally see each other at church on Sundays. Like there's a kind of enmeshment in our lives that I think is part of what we were created for. It's part of the beauty of doing life together in the body of Christ that can actually be, again, even better, even 100 times better than the things that we thought we lost. So that's one of the things that's helped give me contentment in celibacy. The other thing, honestly, is just a sense of feeling like there are things that I get to do as a single person that I couldn't possibly do if I were married. And the same is true in reverse, right? So like my brother John and his wife Heather are married. They've got twin 3-year-olds and a 7-month-old. And I visited them last month, and the kids are adorable and so wonderful. And I was like, oh, their life's so beautiful. They're just doing these wonderful things in the world that I will never do. But then I tried to sit down to write, and it was like the children are over here, and now there's a chaos, and now someone needs a diaper change, and I'm on my laptop being like, I'm trying to be productive, but it's really hard. So I was driving away from their house, and I was like, John and Heather have a wonderful life, and if I had their life, I would never get anything done. And so there was just this recognition that like, yeah, well, like marriage is a gift, kids are a gift, but like singleness is a gift. I've taken to every time somebody's telling like one of those stories about their children, and they're like, then she pulled up the floorboard and pooped into the air vent and put it back down, and it took us 2 weeks to discover it. I'll be standing on the sideline of these conversations, and I always try to find someone, and I look at them and I whisper to them, celibacy is a gift. So I think it's just useful for us to discover that like every vocation has both gifts and challenges within it. And the point is not that like one is better than the other and we all need to be funneled to that one, right? Like marriage is not better than singleness. We don't all need to be funneled into marriage. The reality is both of these vocations, marriage and singleness, are really, really good vocations through which God wants to use some of us, some being the key word here, to bless the world, to bless the body of Christ, to be a gift to the people around us. So the more I leaned into realizing like, oh wait, this singleness thing is actually also a gift. Yes, it's hard. Yes, there are things that feel sorrowful about it, but there's also such delight to be found within it.
Such a great answer. Thank you. Loved it. Alrighty, here we go. This is a long one. Actually, it's not that long. Do you, and you might have answered this in your testimony, but it might be a repetition. Do you believe that the Bible says that having a gay relationship is wrong? And also, do you just classify yourself as being attracted to the same sex, or have you ever classified yourself as being the opposite gender, and that's why you like the same sex? Question mark.
Okay. Yeah, so as far as gender identity is concerned, like, did I ever think of myself as female and that was why I was attracted to men? The answer to that is no. There are some people for whom gender identity and sexuality and non-normative sexuality sort of intersect. That's not my story. That's not the story of most gay people. The trans community is a much smaller subset of LGBTQ. As to the first part of the story, do I think the Bible says no to a same-sex relationship? Yes, that is my understanding of the best reading of the Bible. Again, I recognize that there's complexity within that conversation. I don't think it's a super simple open and shut. But the fact that something is complex doesn't mean that there's not still a best answer. It doesn't mean that we get to just, well, it's complicated, so I just picked the one I like the best. I think it's complex, and yet there is still a best answer that the Bible offers to us. And my understanding is that that best answer is for those who are following Jesus. Again, I don't think the Bible is weighing in specifically on questions like what should be legal in the United States of America. The Bible, frankly, does not weigh in directly on United States of America politics in any fashion, though it may have things indirectly to say about it. But as far as what followers of Jesus are called to, my understanding of the Bible is fairly clearly either called to marriage, defined as one flesh union between male and female, or to singleness. So I, not being particularly drawn to one flesh union between male and female, I'm going for the singleness one. Okay, do we have one more question left in us, or have we finished? Did we get the whole set?
There is one more. There is one more.
Bring it on. Bring it on. Last one. Take us home.
Last one. How do you advise? Oh yeah. Okay. How do you have a friendship with people who identify as transgender?
Oh, how do you have a friendship with people who identify as transgender? A few things that I would say. Well, how do you have a friendship with anyone who does not follow Jesus perfectly? Oh, wait, it's all of us. Nailed it. So if you know how to have a friendship, then you know how to have a friendship with somebody who follows Jesus imperfectly. Or I hope you also have friendships with people who do not follow Jesus at all. Now, a few things that I'll say very briefly about gender identity. Number one, when people identify as transgender, that term, like so many terms in this conversation, can actually mean a variety of things. It may mean that somebody is actually identifying as a gender that's not in accordance with their biological sex or their birth sex. But it may also be, some people use the term transgender and they just mean that they experience gender dysphoria. So for instance, my friend Kat identifies as female, and she was born female, but when she calls herself transgender, what she means is she has, since she was young, she has felt a sense of discomfort about her body as a woman, and she would prefer to have a man's body. Like there's a part of her brain that wishes she were male. She's super in love with Jesus, and part of the reason that she does not identify as male is because she had a long conversation with Jesus and was like, what am I supposed to do about my gender? And she felt like Jesus wanted her to continue identifying as female. So she does, but she calls herself transgender because she finds that word helpful to communicate, hey, I have this experience of gender dysphoria. So I would say, make sure that you know what somebody means when they say that they're transgender. If somebody identifies as a gender that's not the same as their birth sex, so if they identify as born female, but they identify as he, him, or maybe they identify as non-binary, they use they, them pronouns. I would say this, I would encourage you, if you want to be in relationship with a person, which again, I would encourage you to be in relationship with people, that seems to be the Jesus pattern, is that he's super into being in relationship with all kinds of people. I think the best way to be in relationship with people is to honor them by using the language about them that they use for themselves. So my encouragement to you would be to use the name and pronouns that a person identifies themselves with. That doesn't mean that you need to agree with necessarily with the choices they're making about their gender, but I think it's a good way of honoring them. And if you want more on that question, I wrote like a 15-page pastoral paper on why I think it's theologically appropriate and wise to use the name and pronouns that people identify themselves with, even if you don't agree with their gender expression. Which, if you're curious, get my contact information from Nadia or Caleb, and I will send it to you. And then you will have access to it, and you can read all 15 pages of my brilliance on that question. But I think bringing the boat back around to the initial question, how do I befriend a certain kind of person? Befriend them like you befriend everybody else, as an image bearer of God, who is also imperfect and who is also invited into the same radical journey with Jesus as you are. And on that note,
I have one question / comment, but like it's kind of more of a comment. But, like, so there's this person in one of my classes at school, and he like doesn't say he's transgender. He says he's gay. He's just like, oh, hi guys, I'm gay or whatever. And but he makes comments and like acts like he's like opposite gender, but like it's kind of confusing. And so he's like a cool guy, but it feels weird. Like, how do you deal with that?
beautiful. A bit of that came through slightly garbled on my end. So if there was a question there, I missed it. But to the degree that that was a comment, I'm glad that you're in relationship with some people who...
Eva, friend, please type if you want to communicate at this point. Thank you so much. Love you, Eva. Greg.
Caleb.
A question. Okay.
All right, Noah.
I was wondering if you have somebody and you want to come off in a nice, kind way, but also tell them like that being gay is against the Bible. How should you confront them about that without making it seem like you're saying that they're going to hell or something like that, or like being very rude, and like how to do that in a respectful and loving way, basically.
Yeah. So a couple thoughts. The first is I wouldn't find it helpful probably to say that being gay is against the Bible, because again, being gay means a lot of things. Being gay can mean the thing that I am, which is attracted to the same sex. I would describe myself as being gay at this very moment. But I hope that, insofar as I am able, I'm seeking to follow Jesus in the midst of the whole being gay thing. So if I were trying to have a conversation with somebody specifically about sexual ethics and say, like, I actually believe that sex just belongs within a marriage covenant, marriage herein defined as one flesh union between male and female, then so having made that distinction, I would only find it helpful to have that conversation in the same context where I would find it helpful to say to my straight friends who aren't following Jesus or who are sleeping around or whatever. If I have a relationship with somebody where I find it helpful to talk to them about sexual ethics, then we could have that conversation. But usually, if I'm talking to somebody who doesn't know Jesus, sexual ethics is pretty low on my priority list. Because if I were not following Jesus, I would also probably be trying to scout out a boyfriend for myself. So I don't find it particularly helpful if somebody doesn't follow Jesus to feel like I need to lecture them about sexual ethics. I don't want to tell them how I think they should be living their lives, when the reality is the only way somebody will live differently is because Jesus calls them to it. So the most productive thing I think I can do is point people to Jesus and say, like, hey, there's this Jesus guy, and fair warning, if you start following him, he may wreck your life. But I think it's totally worth it. Like, that's the conversation I want to have with them. I don't particularly need to give them the whole laundry list of, like, here are about 15 ways in which I think Jesus will wreck your life when you start following him. I don't tend to talk to people about sexual ethics until I've already talked to them about Jesus and talked to them about the Bible, kind of like we talked about earlier. And I'll also note this, that often the thing that we're most inclined to talk to like sort of address with somebody else is the sins that we personally feel uncomfortable with. Think about greed, right? So greed is the sin that the Bible talks a whole ton about. And I know lots of people running around in evangelical Christian spaces who seem to be living in a way that is reflective of greed. But I almost never hear someone say, like, how should I talk to people about how I think greed is a sin? Because, well, there's a little more greed in most of our own lives, and so we're a little more comfortable with that one. I think often we want to talk to somebody else about the ways in which we feel like they're sinning, that we don't feel like we also are sinning, because we prefer the company of people who sin like we do. So I think it's always good to sort of take a step of caution back and say, well, first, let me take a good hard look at my own life. And second, let me ask, is the thing I need to do right now try to make somebody's life match up more with how I think they should be living if they were following Jesus? Or does my priority just need to be, I got to point this person back to Jesus in the same way that I have to point myself back to Jesus again and again? So that's always where I would start. Hopefully a helpful place to begin, though certainly there is more to be said.
Yes, Greg. Yeah, Greg has given us so much extra time, and I just want to say thank you. You are a delight indeed, sir. And,
thanks. You guys
so
too.
much good food for thought. I want to pray for you, brother, before you head off.
Oh, I'll take it.
Is there anything in particular you'd appreciate prayer for?
Let's see. You could pray. I'm giving another talk on Wednesday. You could pray that I speak wisely and am led by the Lord. I also have a book coming out in February. You could pray that if there are things in that book that are worth saying, that people read them, and if people should not read them, that the Lord causes it to tank and no one ever reads it. It's too late to change the book at this point. But if you want to pray that that book does whatever it's supposed to and doesn't do any of the things it's not supposed to, I would take those prayers.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I look forward, hopefully, to connecting with you again. Definitely soon. Yes, Josh.
Quick question.
Ask one question.
What is your occupation? Are you a writer or public speaker? Also, what are the names of your books? Because I want to write them down.
Oh, these are great questions. My occupation is an interesting mishmash of activities at the moment. I work part-time for a church as a worship leader. And then with the rest of my time, I am a writer and a speaker and a freelance editor. And until recently, until COVID, I also worked at a bakery on Saturdays making buttercream icing. My record is that in a single day, I once made 301 pounds of icing.
What? That's so cool. Awesome.
And to your other good question, the names of my books, my first book is called Single Gay Christian, a title which leaves very little to the imagination. And then my second book, which is coming out in February, is called No Longer Strangers.
Awesome. Thanks, man.
God, I praise you for Greg. I thank you for the way you're using him to advance your kingdom, to help us to understand more about all the ways in which we can love you more. God, the way that you've used him to encourage and spur our faith on tonight, I believe that because of this, we all will be more like you. And I praise you for that. It's the thoughtful way that, you've given him so many gifts in speaking and sharing about you, God. And I ask that you would continue to flow through him on Wednesday as he speaks and shares, that he would speak well and wisely, and that you would give him the desires of his heart as he delights in you. The book that he's coming out with, God, that it would be used to advance your kingdom, that you would give him wisdom and discernment about that, and that people who need to hear the words you've given him would definitely buy that book and have access to it. God, I just praise you and thank you for tonight. I feel like you have answered so many of my prayers concerning tonight and exceeded my expectations, as you are often willing to do. So I pray for just really good rest for Greg tonight and supernatural energy although he seems to be filled with that already all the time anyway. But you would continue to fill him and give him the energy of your in the days to come. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thanks for having me, friends.
Greg, really quick before you go,
Bye.
I want to make sure you see the last comment in the chat by Judith. I think we all agree with her.
Absolutely.
Oh, thanks, Judith.
All right, guys, that is our time. It is 9 o'clock. Greg, thank you. You took it all. Yay! Look forward to next week where Judith herself will be our guest speaker.
Hey.
You guys have a great night. Not if you're willing to hang out, they can hang out with you, but I have a Cowboys game to watch. Love you guys. Good night. Thank you.